My nephew had just turned 7 when he stopped talking at dinner. Not completely. He'd still answer direct questions, still say please and thank you the way my sister-in-law had drilled into him since he could form words. But the easy chatter, the way he used to narrate, everything on his plate like he was hosting a cooking show, the endless stream of Uncle Teddy, did you know, that was gone. I noticed it at Easter. I told myself it was a phase. I noticed it again at the 4th of July cookout. I told myself he was just tired. By the time Thanksgiving rolled around and my nephew sat at the far end of our mother's dining room table with his shoulders folded inward like he was trying to take up less space in the world, I couldn't tell myself anything anymore. His name is Asher. He has his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn jaw. And up until about a year before that Thanksgiving, he had been the loudest, most annoyingly joyful kid I had ever met in my life. I say that with complete love. The kid used to run through my apartment like he owned it, pulling books off my shelves, demanding I explain what words meant, eating all my cereal straight from the box. He was exhausting and wonderful, and I adored him. That Thanksgiving, he ate maybe 4 bites of mashed potato and kept his eyes on the table. I'm a high school history teacher in Raleigh, North Carolina. I've been in classrooms for going on 15 years, and one thing you learn fast in that job is the difference between a kid who's distracted and a kid who's disappearing. Asher looked like he was disappearing. His father, my older brother Vaughn, sat at the head of the table and talked too much, the way he always did when he was performing normalcy. Vaughn could walk into any room and own it. He was the kind of man people described as charismatic, the kind who got voted onto the neighborhood HOA board and coached youth soccer, even though he'd never played a day in his life. He sold commercial real estate in the Research Triangle and made good money doing it. His wife, my sister-in-law Renata, kept refilling people's glasses and laughing at things that weren't quite funny enough to laugh at. Asher didn't look at either of them. After dinner, when the adults had moved into the living room and the football game was on, I found Asher sitting alone on the back porch steps in the cold. He had his arms wrapped around his knees, and he was staring out at my mother's backyard like he could see something in the dark. I couldn't. I sat down next to him without saying anything. "We stayed like that for a minute, you cold?" I finally asked. He shook his head. "You doing okay, bud?" He didn't answer right away. That alone told me something. Asher used to answer every question before you finished asking it. "Uncle Teddy," he said very quietly, "do you think bad things can happen to good people?" I looked at him. His face was completely serious, the way kids' faces get when they're asking something that's been sitting inside them for a long time. "Yeah," I said carefully. "I do." "Why?" He pulled at a loose thread on his sneaker, just wondering. I didn't push. I didn't want to spook him, but I put my arm around his shoulders and I felt him go very still. Not the stiff still of a child who doesn't want to be touched. The still of a child who's been starved of something and is suddenly afraid to breathe in case it disappears. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" I said. "I mean it. Anything." He didn't respond. But when Renata came to the back door and said it was time to go, he looked up at me with an expression I have never been able to fully describe to anyone. It was something between a plea and a resignation, like a person who has decided to stop asking for help because they've learned it doesn't come. He was 7 years old. I went home that night and sat in my kitchen until 2 in the morning with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, trying to talk myself out of what I was feeling. Kids go through phases. Asher was probably stressed about school. Maybe he and Vaughn had an argument. Maybe he was being bullied. Maybe I was projecting, seeing problems that weren't there because I was a divorced, childless 38-year-old man with too much time to overthink things. By the time the sun came up, I had convinced myself of exactly none of that. I started paying closer attention. I texted Renata to ask if Asher could come stay with me for a weekend, the way he used to, before the invitation started getting deflected with excuses. She wrote back within minutes, too quickly, the response already prepared, saying that Asher had a lot of activities and it was a busy time and maybe after the holidays. I called my brother. He didn't pick up. I drove past their house on a Sunday afternoon in December on the pretense of dropping off a birthday card for Renata. When Asher answered the door, I almost didn't recognize him. He'd lost weight. His hair hadn't been cut in a while, He looked at me and then immediately looked past me, over my shoulder, like he was checking who else was there. "Hey, bud," I said, keeping my voice easy. "Just dropping something off for your mom." "She's not home," he said. "Is your dad here?" Something moved across his face. "He's in the garage." We stood there in the doorway for a moment. The house behind him was immaculate in that specific way that always made me uncomfortable. Not the comfortable clutter of a family living in a space, but the staged cleanliness of a house that has rules about disorder. "Asher," I said quietly, "are you okay?" He looked down at his feet. "I'm fine, Uncle Teddy." And then from somewhere inside the house, Vaughn's voice, "Who's at the door?" The boy's whole body changed. It was that fast. 1 second, he was a child standing in a doorway. The next, he was something smaller and pulled in and braced. "Just Uncle Teddy," he called back. "Tell him we're busy." Asher looked up at me with those dark eyes. I handed him the card. He took it with both hands like it was something precious. "Take care of yourself," I told him. I meant it in every possible way. He nodded and closed the door. I sat in my car outside their house for 10 minutes before I drove away. That night, I called my mother. She told me I was reading too much into things. She told me Vaughn had always been high-strung and that Renata was particular about their routines. She told me Asher was a sensitive child and maybe he was just going through something at school. I asked her when she last actually spent time alone with Asher. Without Vaughn or Renata in the room, she couldn't remember. I made a decision. The following Thursday, I knew Vaughn had a lunch meeting downtown. He'd mentioned it at Thanksgiving, one of those offhand things people say without thinking. I knew Renata worked mornings at the pediatric dentist's office, where she was a receptionist, and usually didn't get home until around 1. I knew Asher got off the school bus at the corner of their street at 3:15 and spent roughly 2 hours alone before one of his parents got home. I was parked near the corner at 3:10. When the bus pulled up and Asher came down the steps with his backpack, he stopped dead when he saw me leaning against my car. For a second, his face did something complicated. Hope and fear moving across it in the same instant. "Hey," I said, "want to get some hot chocolate?" He looked around, checking. "Just us," I said. "I'll have you home before anyone gets back." He hesitated for a long moment. Then he walked toward me and got in the car. We went to a diner about 2 miles from their house. Asher ordered hot chocolate and a grilled cheese and ate like he hadn't had a real meal in a while. I didn't rush him. I talked about nothing, a funny thing that happened at school, a movie I'd seen. I let him breathe. When the food was mostly gone, I set down my coffee cup and said, "Asher, you can talk to me, whatever it is." He stared at his mug. "The thing you said at Thanksgiving," I said, "about bad things happening to good people. You've been thinking about something specific." Very slowly, he nodded. "Does it have to do with home?" He nodded again. I kept my voice as steady as I have ever kept anything in my life. "Does someone hurt you?" The silence that followed lasted maybe 5 seconds. It felt like standing on the edge of something enormous. "Dad says it's discipline," he said. "He says that's how you make boys strong." I put both hands flat on the table to keep them from shaking. "What does he do?" What Asher told me over the next 20 minutes was not the worst thing I have ever heard. I know that, technically. I've read the news. I teach teenagers who have come to school carrying things I can barely imagine. But it was the worst thing I had ever heard about someone I loved, in a voice that belonged to a 7-year-old who was choosing his words carefully because he'd learned that talking had consequences. Vaughn had a room in the house, not the basement, but the spare bedroom at the end of the hall that had always been kept locked. Asher called it the discipline room. He said his father took him there when he'd done something wrong, which seemed to happen often, and for reasons Asher could not always identify in advance. He said it had happened twice the week before. He said his mother knew and did not stop it. He said it was no drama. That was the part that undid me. The flat, careful recitation of a child who has normalized something that should never have been normalized. "Does he leave marks?" I asked. Asher pulled up the sleeve of his jacket. I looked at my nephew's arm. I breathed. I told him to pull his sleeve back down. "Okay," I said. Okay, listen to me. What happened to you is not discipline. It's not how you make someone strong. What your dad is doing is wrong, and it's against the law, and none of it is your fault. Do you understand me? He looked at me with eyes that were trying to believe that. I'm going to help you, I said. But I need you to trust me. And I need you to go home today like normal. Because I need a couple of days to do this the right way. Can you do that? He thought about it. Will you actually do something? He asked. Or will you talk to Dad and it'll get worse? The question hit me like a hand around my throat, because it told me exactly how many times this child had hoped an adult would intervene and hadn't. I'm not going to talk to your dad, I said. I promise you. I took photographs of his arm before I drove him home. He asked me not to tell anyone. I told him I understood why he felt that way, and that I was going to have to tell someone, but that I was going to be very careful about who and how. I told him I would not let anything worse happen to him. I have never made a promise I was more terrified of breaking. That night, I photographed what I'd seen and wrote down everything Asher had told me, word for word. While I still remembered the exact language he'd used, I called my brother's number and didn't leave a message. I paced my apartment for 3 hours. The next morning, I walked into the Wake County Department of Social Services and filed a report. The woman at the intake desk was named. I remember this clearly. Ms. Pollard. She was somewhere in her 50s, had reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she listened to me with the kind of focused stillness that told me she had heard things like this before and had made a decision long ago not to look away from them. She did not minimize what I said. She did not suggest alternative explanations. She asked clear questions and wrote down the answers, and told me that a case would be opened and an investigator would be in contact within 24 to 48 hours. I asked about Asher's safety in the meantime. She explained what they could and couldn't do before an investigation had been conducted. I understood, legally. I hated it. The investigator who called me the next day was a man named Mr. Aldis from the Child Protective Services Unit. He was methodical and careful, and told me that in cases involving reported physical abuse of a minor, they would be conducting a visit to the home and a separate interview with the child at his school, away from the parents. I asked if that was safe. Asher at school, being interviewed. He explained that they had people specifically trained for exactly that, and that the interview would be conducted in a way designed to avoid re-traumatization. He told me I had done the right thing by coming forward. I went home and called in a personal day to work, and then sat on my couch and shook for about an hour. The next 72 hours were the longest of my life. I didn't contact Vaughn, I didn't contact Renata, I didn't tell my mother because I knew she would call Vaughn and I couldn't risk that. I checked my phone every 20 minutes. I slept maybe 4 hours over 3 nights. On the 3rd day, Mr. Aldis called and told me that following the school interview and home visit, the decision had been made to remove Asher from the home on an emergency basis, pending a full investigation. He said Asher had been interviewed by a forensic specialist and had disclosed. He said the marks on his arm were consistent with what I had reported and with what the child had described. He said Asher was safe. I sat down on my kitchen floor and put my head in my hands. What happened in the weeks that followed was not neat or clean or simple, and I want to be honest about that. Because I think when people imagine this kind of situation, they imagine justice happening quickly and in a straight line. It doesn't. My parents found out. My mother did not take it the way I had hoped. She cycled through disbelief and then a desperate need to find an alternative explanation. Maybe Asher had exaggerated. Maybe the investigation had gotten it wrong. Maybe there was some context we were missing. My father, who had always been the quieter and more stoic of the two, sat at their kitchen table and did not say a single word for a very long time. When he finally spoke, he asked me only one thing. "Did you do the right thing?" "Yes," I told him. "I know I did." He nodded. That was all. Vaughn was charged with felony child abuse. When I found out, I drove to a park near my apartment and sat on a bench and stared at the duck pond for 45 minutes. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like grief and relief at the same time, which is a combination I did not know was possible before that year. Renata, it emerged during the investigation, had not actively participated in the abuse. But she had known. She had said nothing, done nothing, continued to send her son to a locked room at the end of a hallway because it was easier than the alternative. Prosecutors charged her with failure to protect. She accepted a plea deal. She cooperated with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence, 2 years with probation. I don't know how to feel about that number. Some days I think it was fair given her cooperation. Most days I think about Asher's arm, and I don't think about fairness at all. Asher was placed in emergency foster care while the investigation proceeded. I submitted an application to become his emergency placement within the first week. There are forms and background checks and home studies and interviews. And none of it moves at the speed you want it to when you know a 7-year-old is sleeping in a stranger's house and doesn't know when any of this is going to stop. It took 11 weeks. 11 weeks of weekly supervised visits at a child advocacy center, of Asher sitting across from me in a room with soft chairs and a box of Legos in the corner, of watching him slowly, incrementally start to take up space again. He started talking more. Not the way he used to, not yet, but more. He told me about the other kids in the foster home. He told me he had gotten a perfect score on a spelling test. He told me, very seriously, that he had decided he wanted to learn to cook. I can teach you, I told him. You don't know how to cook, he said. I can learn with you. For the first time in what felt like years, he grinned at me. It was maybe 30% of his old grin, but it was there. The day I brought him home, he stood in the doorway of my second bedroom, which I had spent 2 weekends converting from a storage space into an actual child's room, with a desk and bookshelves and a bed with a comforter he had picked out himself from a website, blue with small white stars on it. And he didn't say anything for a long time. It's yours, I said. All of it. I've never had a desk, he said. I always did my homework on the floor. I had to leave the room for a minute after that. The trial was 8 months after Thanksgiving. I won't go through all of it because some of it is not mine to tell. It belongs to Asher, and he is the one who will decide someday how much of his story he wants to share. What I will say is that the evidence was significant, that multiple witnesses testified, and that Vaughn's attorneys tried every available angle to discredit the case. They suggested Asher had been coached. They questioned the integrity of the forensic interview. They hired an expert witness who testified about the malleability of children's memories. Asher testified. He was 8 years old by then. He sat in that courtroom with a victim's advocate next to him, and a screen partially blocking his view of his father. And he answered every question in a voice that was quiet and clear and did not waver the way I was wavering inside my chest watching him. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Vaughn was convicted on all counts. At sentencing, the judge said that the systematic, deliberate nature of the abuse, combined with the documentation found during the home search and the child's consistent and credible testimony, warranted the maximum allowed under statute. He received 12 years. He will be eligible for parole, but the sex offender registry is permanent. I sat in that courtroom and watched my brother receive his sentence and felt something I did not expect. Nothing for a moment. Just silence inside my head. And then, slowly, like a tide coming in, something that might have been relief. My mother cried. My father put his hand on my shoulder and left it there. On the drive home, Asher asked me if his dad was going to come back. Not for a very long time, I said. And you'll be an adult by then. You'll be making your own choices. He thought about that. What if I don't want to see him? Then you don't have to, I said. That will be your choice, always. He looked out the window. Okay, he said, and seemed to file this information away somewhere. Kids have this ability to accept enormously heavy things and then just carry them forward. I don't know if that's resilience or necessity. Probably both. The foster placement became a legal guardianship about 4 months after the trial. Renata had signed away her parental rights as part of her plea arrangement. Vaughn contested the termination of his rights from PRISM. His lawyer sent letters, made arguments, but the court found, given the severity and duration of the abuse, that termination was in the child's best interest. It was finalized on a Tuesday morning in a courthouse downtown, and Asher and I went out for pancakes afterward because it was the only celebration I could think of that a 9-year-old would actually want. He ate an enormous stack with strawberries and whipped cream. and then leaned back in his chair with the deep satisfaction of someone who has been through something enormous and is still here. "So you're like my dad now?" he asked. "I'm your uncle who is also your guardian," I said, "which is its own thing. But you're who I live with." "Yes. And you're who I call if something happens at school." "Yes." He considered this. "That's basically a dad." I didn't argue with him. I want to tell you that everything got easier from there, in a clean, steady upward line, because that would be a satisfying thing to tell you. It didn't. Recovery from trauma is not linear, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. Asher had nightmares for the better part of a year. He saw a trauma-informed therapist named Dr. Waverly twice a week for a long time, and still sees her once a month now. There were weeks where he'd regress, become clingy or angry or withdrawn in ways that felt like backward steps. There were nights I'd hear him down the hall and go sit with him until he fell back asleep. And there were mornings after those nights where I was not at my best as a teacher or as a person. And I had to be okay with that. I had to accept that I was figuring this out as I went. The same way he was. What I didn't expect was how much he would teach me. Asher has this quality, and I don't know if it predates everything that happened to him or grew alongside it, of noticing things. He notices when I'm stressed before I've registered it myself. He points out things on walks that I would have walked past without seeing. Last spring, he spent 3 weeks carefully documenting the behavior of a pair of nesting birds in the tree outside his bedroom window in a composition notebook with little hand-drawn diagrams because he wanted to understand what they were doing and why. He's 10 now. He plays soccer on a rec team with kids from his school. He's decided he wants to be an ornithologist, which I learned was a bird scientist, and I told him I thought that was a completely excellent life plan. He still has hard days. He still wakes up sometimes with that faraway look that tells me he's been somewhere in his sleep that I can't follow him to. But there is more light in his face now than shadow. More days where he runs through my apartment the way he used to. Louder, more present, more himself than days where he retreats. I got a letter from my brother in prison about a year after the sentencing. I won't describe its contents in detail because, honestly, it doesn't deserve the space. It contained no apology. It contained a great deal of language about how he had tried to be a good father and had not been understood, about how the system had failed his family, about how he hoped I knew what I had done. I folded it back into its envelope and put it in a drawer, and a few weeks later took it out and burned it in my backyard grill. Asher wasn't home. I didn't tell him about it. Some things are not his to carry. My mother eventually came to a place of acceptance, not quickly, not easily, and with stops along the way where she said things to me that I have mostly chosen to let go of. She comes to Asher's soccer games now. She brings snacks she knows he likes. She is a grandmother to him in the ways that matter. And I think she is also working through something private and enormous that she may never fully talk about. I give her grace for that because I don't think it's easy to learn. At 70 years old, that a child you raised became someone who could do what Vaughn did. I don't know what that does to a person. I try not to add to the weight of it. My father and I talk more than we ever did before any of this. That part I didn't expect either. There is something I want to say, because it matters, and because I've thought about it a great deal since that Thanksgiving when I sat on my mother's back porch steps, next to a boy who had stopped being loud. I almost didn't say anything. I want you to know that. Not because I didn't care about Asher, but because every voice in my head was telling me I could be wrong, that it wasn't my place, that I could destroy my family over something I had misread, that Vaughn would never. Because he was my brother and I knew him, or thought I knew him. Every mechanism that exists in human psychology to protect existing relationships and avoid difficult truths was working overtime in my brain during those weeks between Thanksgiving and a Thursday afternoon at the diner. I almost talked myself out of it. Multiple times. What stopped me, in the end, was Asher's face when he got in my car. The way he looked over his shoulder before he closed the door. The question he asked me at the diner. Not, will you help me? But, will you actually do something? Because he had already learned the difference between adults who notice and adults who act. If you are reading this and something is nagging at you about a child in your life, a niece, a student, a neighbor kid, a child at your church, I am asking you to take it seriously. I am not asking you to be certain. I am not asking you to be certain. I am not asking you to have proof. I am asking you to make the call. In North Carolina, where I live, any person can report suspected child abuse to the Child Protective Services hotline at any time, and the National Child Help Hotline at 1-800-422-4453 operates 24 hours a day. If you are a teacher or school employee or medical professional, you are a mandated reporter, which means it is not optional. But even if you are not, you can call. You can say, "I'm not sure, but I'm concerned." That is enough to start. The worst case scenario if you're wrong is that an investigation finds nothing and a family is briefly inconvenienced. The worst case scenario if you're right and you say nothing is something I will not describe here. But I think you can imagine it. Asher is outside right now, in the backyard watching those birds with his notebook. He just knocked on the window to show me something. A fledgling, I think, making its first real attempts at the air. He's grinning. The full version of the grin, all the way to his eyes. It took a long time to get here. It will keep taking time. The way healing does, in uneven increments that sometimes feel like progress and sometimes feel like standing still. But he's here. He's safe. He knocked on the window to show me a bird. That's everything. I've thought a lot about what it actually takes to do the right thing. Not in the abstract, the way you think about it when nothing is on the line. But in real life, when doing the right thing means blowing up your family, losing your brother, watching your mother cry at a courthouse, and spending 11 weeks driving to a child advocacy center to sit with a 7-year-old in a room with soft chairs and a box of Legos, because that's the only place you're allowed to see him. What I've come to understand is that the right thing almost never announces itself. It doesn't feel righteous in the moment. It feels like fear. It feels like doubt. It feels like the very real possibility that you are wrong, that you are making the worst mistake of your life, that you are destroying something that cannot be rebuilt. That's what I lived with for the weeks between Thanksgiving and the afternoon. I sat across from Asher in that diner and asked him the question I was terrified to ask. Every action has a consequence, and I knew that the consequence of what I was about to set in motion was going to be enormous. What I had to decide was whether the consequence of staying silent was worse. It was. Of course it was. Asher's arm told me that without a single word. Here's the thing about moral courage that nobody talks about. It is not the absence of fear. It is doing the thing while afraid. Vaughn was my older brother. I had looked up to him my whole life. The part of me that was still a kid in that house with him did not want to believe what I was seeing. Intelligence, the kind that actually matters in a life, is not about being right all the time. It's about being willing to follow what you know to be true, even when everything around you is pushing you toward a more comfortable conclusion. Asher asked me, sitting in that booth with his hot chocolate, "Will you actually do something? Not will you help me. Will you actually do something?" He already knew the difference. He had already learned it at 7 years old from watching adults notice and then look away. I think about that question more than almost anything else from those months. Because it wasn't just a question about me. It was a question about what kind of person I had been up until that moment, and what kind of person I was going to choose to be going forward. Resilience is not something you are born with. It is something you build, one decision at a time, and it is built most durably out of the decisions that cost you something. Filing that report cost me. The trial cost me. Losing my relationship with my brother cost me, even though he was never really the person I thought he was. That loss is real and strange, and I carry it alongside everything else. But Asher is out in the backyard right now with a notebook and a pair of binoculars. And last week he made me laugh so hard at dinner that I spilled my coffee. And every night he goes to sleep in a room that is his, in a house where nothing is locked and nothing requires that kind of bracing. The consequence of action was hard. The consequence of inaction would have been unbearable. I chose. And I would choose it again every single time.